Facebook is up. Let's get YouTube going, maybe? No, I forgot to get my computer. Well, whatever. Okay, YouTube's up. All right. Hey, everybody. What is it? Welcome to the 8:30 Live, because it's 8:30. I hope, you know what? I will get the computer. I hope everybody had the opportunity to go outside today and see the snow flurries in May in New York City. That's uncommon, but, whatever. What are you going to do? Personally, I think it's a bit magical, but of course I know that in reality, it's very scientific and, just a disaster for the environment. So that's that. If you've watched Planet of the Humans, which, by the way, apparently is just a ridiculous amount of just lying about the environmental movement and about the stats on renewable energy. But if you've watched Planet of the Humans, you know that we're ruining the place. And today's snow flurries are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. In any event, let's see what's happening. What's good today? Oh man. I don't know if you know this, but literally just before this live started, it came out on Ars Technica that the CDC leaked the 17-page plan for reopening the states. So if you want to see what was in the 17-page plan and how incredibly onerous it was for, daycares and institutions of faith and all these businesses, go check it out. It's kind of ridiculous how absolutely innocuous this is. It's so, is that the word? Innocuous? Man, I'm losing my vocabulary in quarantine. I don't talk to anybody, so I get to exercise my words. Good. Shit. Anyway, the point is that the suggestions in the CDC report are not at all outside the norms. They're actually quite mundane. Just go look at them for yourself. It's things like, one, well, wear masks, of course. And two, if for childcare, consider getting rid of plush toys. Mind you, the Trump administration said that it didn't want to release this because the restrictions were too tight, that not every place in the country should be treated exactly the same way and have the exact same rules, and that it was too harsh on institutions of faith in particular, and on small businesses. And reading this, basically every line is a suggestion. There's almost nothing in there that says you have to do this, and it's just a bunch of really good suggestions for maintaining hygiene, for example, faith-based institutions not sharing communal items until there's widespread testing. It's all incredibly straightforward, simple stuff, things that people should already know how to do. And then there's phases. So there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And in each phase, you're recommended to do different things. That is to say, to slowly reopen and go back to business as usual. And it's absolutely insane that this document, I encourage you to go read it because it's short and it's highly repetitive. Most of the suggestions are just things that every business should do in its reopening. And it's just absolutely ridiculous that the administration decided to bottle this up. Now, of course, one of the big reasons it decided to bottle it up has to do with the fact that the phases spelled out by the CDC don't line up with the phases put forward in the Reopen the Economy plan, which the Trump administration put out. So in that regard, it contradicts with the administration. But it's so frustrating that the Trump administration just doesn't care about the CDC or any of these best practices or lessons learned from other countries. So whatever. The report is now out. It's absolutely nothing you'll be surprised by, I don't think, but still have a look, because in knowing that there's nothing particularly restrictive or prescriptive in it, I think we can all appreciate that this really comes down to a political fight that the administration wants to pick insofar as it being right. Okay, so that was that. One of the other things I wanted to mention today, as an alert to folks in Manhattan or who live in Manhattan or what have you, anybody who sees this, particularly my constituents in Lower Manhattan, our county, New York County, Manhattan, has a 49.2% response rate to the census. I don't know if you think that's good, and I don't know if you think that's bad, but it's bad. We are way below the rest of the country, which has an average response rate of 58.2%. And we're even below the rest of New York State, which has a response rate of 52.7%. So Manhattan, you're sucking it up, and we have one of the most densely packed populations in the country. If you don't fill out the census, we will A, lose representation in Congress, and B, lose federal funding. If you think that we get shortchanged in terms of funding for healthcare, transportation, disaster relief, climate change mitigation, if you think that it's a problem and New York City does not get enough federal funds to deal with all of these problems, then guess what? Fill out the census. Because why should they give us more money when they think there's fewer people that live here than actually do? So we really want to we're below 50%, which basically means, we have a sense of how many people live here or how many households, apartments, and therefore you can estimate how many households live here. We're at less than half the response rate for the number of people who should be living in New York. And yeah, you can estimate these things, and you might say, well, let's just go with the estimate. But no, that's not how the census works, and that's not how federal funding works. So if you want the money from the government and you want fair representation in Congress, like literally the number of representatives you have relative to other parts of the country, then for the love of God, please fill out the census. If we have a response rate below 50% and the rest of the country is, at 60%, what that means is we'll get 10% fewer representatives than we should, 10% fewer dollars than we should. And remember, the census is about residents. It's not about citizens. So I understand there's been concern about immigrant populations filling out the census, fear that then the federal government will use that information to come for them. There is no question on immigration status on the census. That was a battle that was fought and won. Furthermore, the census is not allowed to be used to identify vulnerable populations in that way, although who knows what the Trump administration will do. They have this characteristic of not necessarily adhering to the letter nor the spirit of the law. But ultimately, the best defense that any of our communities have against bad policy is having a bigger hand in the crafting of that policy. And that means representation, and that means making sure that everyone is counted. So if you haven't filled out the census, please do. My census2020.gov, go fill it out. I think a big problem for Manhattan in particular is that as a relatively wealthy area with lots of folks who own, you know what, I take it back. I was going to say that people left the city and didn't fill out the census, but if you look at the map, the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, and Inwood are all the most well responded, which isn't to say that they're necessarily over 50%, but Lower Manhattan is absolute trash. Chinatown, East Village, Civic Center, Chelsea, we're basically below 14th Street is just terrible, with the exception of some parts of the Lower East Side, which I think might be due to NYCHA because they have access to sort of a captive population. So please fill out the census and urge your friends to fill out the census. And even if you don't live in New York, please remember to fill out the census. This is important. Amy Miller's got a point. What about people who left the city? Are they having to fill it out in the place they went to escape the virus? Doesn't apply to me. I filled it out when I was still in Brooklyn. Good for you, Amy. Thank you for filling it out. And the answer is you fill it out for your primary residence. And since you can do it online, it used to be, somebody would come knock on your door or you'd get it in the mail. I mean, both of those things will still happen. But because you can fill it out online, you can actually respond to the census from whichever second home you happen to be occupying. Or, well, I'll leave it at that. Amy, to be clear, my question is not if they remember to do it, but if they were supposed to put their regular residence or where they happen to be living. If you plan to return, it's basically your primary residence. So unless you've straight up moved to another part of the state or another part of the country, you should put your primary residence, and that would be where you attest to you're adding to the population. So I believe that should answer your question, but use your primary residence as your census address. Okay. Another thing that I wanted to just sort of mention, I saw this sweet article that relates to a book that I love, which is Lord of the Flies. And this is not about politics, but it's just a really interesting story. And I came across it, and I think folks should know about it because it's fun. So basically, Lord of Flies is, of course, or maybe not of course, but it is a fictional tale about a class of schoolboys who get stranded on an island and then try to form a society. And then the society basically devolves into chaos. And it is both the libertarian dream and the analysis of a libertarian dystopia, because these boys have no rules to govern them. They create a self-governing society because there are no adults, there are no parents. They just have to figure it out for themselves. But ultimately, the bigger ones, the stronger ones, the ones that are more violent end up with the political power because for many reasons, one of them being that they're willing to use violence to enforce their rule. And this is, of course, the big concern, at least of mine, of libertarianism and anarchy and unmitigated possession of firearms, which is that it's not the loudest voice that wins, it's the one who's most ready to resort to violence when there's no collective force to sanction that violence. And so libertarians make great hay of the fact that government is just sanctioned violence, but the reason for that is violence doesn't go away just because it's unsanctioned. Violence exists, and the best way, I think, to corral wanton violence or compulsive violence or coercive violence, rather, is to have a society which collectively deems what shall be allowed and what shall not be allowed, so that you don't have individuals making those decisions for everybody else. So one might say that government is terrible, but as Winston Churchill would say, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other ones which have been tried from time to time. And I always try to stress this. I was at Occupy Wall Street. There were a lot of utopian anarchists there. And ultimately, the idea that power ceases to exist because you don't acknowledge it or you don't have structures for it is incorrect. Power exists no matter what you do, and people will exercise it. And this is one of the things I think that really, really reared its head at Occupy, and I think caused a lot of problems from what I could see. Ultimately, just because you claim to have a flat structure doesn't mean that everybody's equal. Equality is basically impossible to enforce, and when you have no structure for directing the will of the majority or the will of at least the people involved, you have individuals who assert authority through other means, be it because they provided financial backing, like Ben and Jerry, be it because they're particularly charismatic, like a couple of folks who were down there. And luckily, we didn't have a situation where folks were violent. But in lots of instances, you'll have just violence ruling the day. And so, Lord of the Flies sort of paints that picture. But the whole point of what I was saying was there was actually a real life case, sort of Lord of the Flies, when 6 schoolboys basically played hooky, got on a boat, and ended up stranded for 15 months on a small rocky island in the Pacific by Tonga. Tonga being a nation which will actually soon be underwater because of rising sea levels. But its big claim to fame, aside from the fact that it might disappear soon, is that it is basically directly on the equator. So they sell the air rights for geosynchronous satellites because nations really want to park their satellites on top of Tonga or fly them through Tonga's airspace because they happen to be on the geosynchronous orbit. Anyway, whatever. I once met the Princess of Tonga, who was telling me she was in China. This was in China. And she was telling me I was like, why are you in China? She's like, I'm here to negotiate rights to the airspace for my country. And I was like, why? She's like, because they fly satellites over us. So fascinating stuff. Anyway, what happened to these boys who were lost for 15 months at sea? Well, the answer is, and it's an interesting story, so you can go look it up. The answer is they set up their little society, and over 15 months, were able to accomplish a lot. They farmed chickens, which they found on the island, yams, again, which they found on the island from folks who had lived there and then left 100 years prior. And this was in 1966. So in 1866, by 1866, the island was basically abandoned by the native population. But, you know, contrary to these folks, now I will say this is a smaller group than was in Lord of the Flies, but contrary to what a lot of folks might think, it didn't devolve into a pecking order and it didn't devolve into arguments. They basically made a pact that they would never fight each other, and that when there was conflict, they resolved it by giving themselves a timeout. So these were boys the age of, well, I guess they started when it was 12 and 13-year-olds, and it ended when they were 13 and 14 or so. But just a really interesting story about what happens when people are left to survive in the wild under great strain. And it's quite possible, you know, young children just figure out how to work together. So let's see. Amy Miller says two things. Also, okay, I don't care that much about this, but I was curious the impact of the fact I had been subletting. Oh, this is about the census. Sublettings, and so the regular residents of that apartment and me both filled out the same place, even though we weren't living together. Well, that would sort of lead to an overcount, potentially, unless you plan to come back to the city, in which no biggie, but really it'll be about where you consider your primary residence. But if at the time you consider that your primary residence and you filled it out, no biggie, because ultimately, I mean, one person is a drop in the bucket in New York, and still a lot of that funding will be tied to New York State, which I believe you're still living in. Amy Miller, what happened with these boys on the island? Can you get back to it? Yes, so that was the resolution of it. And so there was actually, and so ultimately they were found by the youngest son of like the richest Australian in the world, or at the time, an Australian electronics magnate who just happened to like sailing and took a detour in a path that he was charting and saw them. Well, he was going by the island. It's the island of Ata, and he was going by the island. He saw that there was fire marks on the side of a hill, and he was like, "That's weird. There aren't usually evidences of fire on tropical islands." And then he saw the boys diving into the water, and they swam over to him and were like, "Hey, hi, we've just been stuck here for 15 months. Can you save us?" Basically. And he was like, "This is nuts." So he called, and they were like, "We all escaped from this school." Escaped. They were at a boarding school, not a boarding school. They were at a Catholic school, and they had played hooky. And it was like, we all went to this school, and then we left and stole a boat to get away and just like hang out for the day, and ended up on this island for over a year. And he called up the school and was like, he radioed in and was basically like, "Hey, is this true?" And they were like, "Wow, if you really found these kids, then this is a miracle." And apparently he sold the rights, or in conjunction with the children, he sold the rights to their story and to a movie production house. And so I think there's supposed to be a movie about this, but it seems so out there that like we would know about it. Like it would be a famous movie. This is quite the story, isn't it? It's a rather obscure tale given the incredible nature of it. It's almost like Castaway, right? But Castaway, it's like a combination of Castaway and Lord of the Flies. Except, Castaway was also based on a true story. Although I guess Tom Hanks's character was stranded for a couple of years. But these boys were stranded for over a year. They tended this fire. So a big part of Lord of the Flies is tending the fire that allows them to create smoke signals to get the attention of passerbys. And they become incapable of maintaining the fire because nobody wants to climb the hill to do it. And so eventually they just kind of give up and what have you. But these boys like rotated, they had chores. They basically split up into three segments of two, and then they would rotate the chores of tending the fire, of cooking, of cleaning, etc. And so, it was a really remarkable story. And one of the more remarkable pieces is, at one point, one of the boys fell off a cliff and broke his leg, and the others went down, carried him back up, set his leg with twine and wood to splint it, and it healed perfectly. And when they got back to Australia, because they were rescued and picked up, the physician remarked, he was like, this kid's leg healed perfectly. This is incredible. So these 13, 14-year-olds, figured it out, and operating as a team were able to survive for 15 months. I guess they were lucky to some extent that they found the remains of, I guess, a village at the top of the island. It was, there's a big dormant volcano that you can go up, and then inside people had settled. But before that, for several months, 3 months or so, they had just been like fishing and living off the land. It's really remarkable. I encourage folks to check it out because it was in The Guardian today. Really interesting stuff. Amy Miller, had they read Lord of the Flies before it happened? No. So they had no knowledge. I don't even know if Lord of the Flies had been written. Lord of the Flies was written, I think, in the 70s or 80s. And these kids got lost in 1966. So you know what? I can look that up real fast. Lord of the Flies. Let's find out. What I can say is that Lord of the Flies was not based on this. The author talks about never mind. Lord of the Flies was written in 1954. So it was written 12 years before this went down. But the author of Lord of the Flies, the author of Lord of the Flies, talks about, the author of the article talks about the author of Lord of the Flies and how that person's background shaped their dystopian view of what would happen if humans were just sort of left to their own devices and were not like grown-ups who had been inculcated with the idea of civilization. Basically, they'd evolve into, just like despotism. Let's see, Julianne, I'm an agnostic existentialist, Catholic. Wow, this is so long. Agnostic existentialist Catholic person. And the other day I was reading an article about the distribution of the Eucharist. That, I believe, is when they give you the body of Christ, the wafers. A priest in Italy was freaking out about the way it was being distributed to parishioners. There was a suggestion that the priest consecrate the Eucharist in little individual plastic bags. Presumably this is getting back to the first thing we spoke about, which is the 17-page report from the CDC on how to appropriately reopen the economy. Consecrate the Eucharist in little individual plastic bags and then distribute it to the communicants. Catholics believe the Eucharist is the actual body of Christ, so the priest was really offended that Jesus would be treated this way. Thinking about it now, it really isn't that offensive because the Eucharist has been carried into, I don't know what a pyx is, but into a pyx to those who can receive it. A pyx is a round plastic golden box, which is only slightly different than a plastic bag. All of this is to say religious people are the ones being onerous. Yes. Well, religion is often at odds with science, and I'm not a particularly religious person myself. Well, what I will say is, there are lots of reasons that people believe that religion is important. That's fine. And there are lots of things in religion that conflict with some of what science has to say. So, for example, Orthodox Jews must have their minyan in person. Minyan being congregation, which is large enough. There are requirements in Judaism for the number of people, basically think about it like eligible voters. But there's a minimum number of eligible Jews that have to show up to have a service. And in Orthodox teachings, you have to do that in person. You can't do it over Zoom, for example, over a teleconference. So I can understand it, but I certainly I cannot understand why the Eucharist, why it would be a problem to consecrate that in a baggie or anything else, because it's the consecration that makes it the body of Christ, not the thing that carries it. And if they didn't want to use plastic baggies, they could use anything else they wanted, so long as those things were sterilized, which would be as simple as dipping them in alcohol, perhaps, or in bleach, or what have you, and then rinsing them off in water. So I just don't really understand why. It is a minor hassle to figure out a way to do almost anything in a safe way in the time of coronavirus. I understand that these things are annoying, but there is a way to do almost everything you would normally do just safely, and it's only slightly more an issue. For example, wearing masks. It's a safe practice. It is slightly annoying, but only marginally so. So I saw a meme tweet today, which was an updated version of the trolley problem. For those who don't know the trolley problem, it is a philosophical question meant to make you think about, I don't know, things. Basically, there's a trolley and there's two tracks. On one track, there is one person tied to the tracks. On the other track, there are 5 people tied to the tracks. Now, the trolley is approaching the split, and you have a lever. If you pull the lever one way, it goes down the track with one person. If you pull the lever the other way, it goes down the track with 5 people. Whether you pull the lever or not, somebody's going to die, either the one person or the 5 people. It'll be, in some cases, it's geared to the one person. In some cases, it's geared to the 5 people. In some cases, it's random. Sometimes there's 100 people on the trolley who will die if it derails, whatever. That's the trolley problem. And this trolley problem was basically, there's a trolley. There are 5 grandmas tied to a track. If you pull the lever, you can send it down a track where nobody dies. But you have to wear a face mask when you buy a toaster. What do you do? So, it's just like, what do you truly value in this world? Amy Miller, replying to Amy Miller. At the time, I absolutely thought I would be staying in that area, just not that apartment. It's fine. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Sometimes these things happen, just like when you change your voter registration. And don't worry, in 10 years, you'll get the opportunity to do it all over again. Now, we're talking about the census, filling out, whether you should fill it out for your primary address or where you happen to be staying because of the pandemic or what have you. Julianne, also a cool story about the boys on Tonga. They were from Tonga, and then the island that they were stranded on was called Ata, and then they ended up in Australia. I will use this story if I ever get to teach Lord of the Flies. I got to teach some of it during my practicum from TESOL. I wish I had known about it then. It's a fun story. I did not even know about it until today. Amy, if they had turned violent, we would have heard about it. It was a fact they were kind that it was boring. That's true. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but it is certainly true that the media loves sensationalism and, of course, focuses on negative things. It is rarely we get the human interest stories every so often, but good news doesn't make news, right? So you're probably right that if they had resorted to cannibalism and only 3 had made it back after they had eaten two boys, they probably would have been covered and there would have been a movie. But as of now, because it came out all well and good, not sensational enough. Oh, just 15 boys who didn't kill each other. Julian Bounting, it's even better that they were escaping a Catholic school. I mean, yeah, sure. It is coincidental given the other things we've spoken about regarding Catholicism today. But really, it was a quite strict Catholic school, and they were running away because they were super duper bored. I'll bet they weren't bored for 15 months after that. Religion is comforting, but most likely not true. Most likely. Science has proven enough that we know the classic religious views are not correct. This has always made me very, very sad. This is why I might call myself an agnostic existential Catholic. Check out Possibilism by a neuroscientist. It makes a lot of sense. Every religion is false except apparently for Buddhism. Buddhism and all their meditative practices just keep getting better as science learns more about meditation. I mean, I don't know, whatever. My cousin, who is a world-renowned physicist and biologist, or biophysicist, whatever, world-renowned, is intensely religious and really believes that, one, that the teachings of the Torah, he's Jewish, as I am half Jew, he's on my Jewish side, that the teachings of the Torah need not be reconciled with science, nor that science necessarily contradicts them. There's a lot of thou shalt this, thou shalt not do that, and that's not scientific, that's moral and pertains to humans. But also science has hardly disproven the existence of God. In fact, there was an article that came out saying that his work on the emergence of life disproved God, and he wrote a whole thing about how you cannot say that his work disproves the existence of God. So, as of right now, I think it'd be difficult to say that. Certainly there are a lot of things that people say about their religion that conflicts with science, the age of the earth, et cetera, et cetera. But unless you take these stories literally, and it's arguable whether most actual religious people actually take them literally, there are obviously fundamentalists who do, but unless you take them literally, there's not necessarily a lot of, there's certainly no disproof of God. Of course, one cannot disprove a negative. You can't prove that something doesn't exist because there's no evidence to demonstrate that it's not there. It leaves no trail. But whatever. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention was a story that came out about the Republican Party. But I don't want you to think it's about the Republican Party because it's really about political parties generally. And we've talked a lot about political parties recently and the way they function because of this whole presidential primary situation in New York. But there was an article that was released today about how an election official felt pressured by the Republican Party in Colorado to certify somebody for the ballot who should not be on the ballot. And they made it sound as if this was a situation where the Republicans, where the party was pressuring the government and trying to put the screws to an elected official, or really it was a government worker, this person wasn't elected, but put the screws to an election official to do what they wanted in contravention of the law. But the story is really a bit more complicated than that, and I wanted to go over it because it's just so emblematic of how politics works and why the political parties are such important institutions and why primaries, and in particular, primaries as a tool for electing party leadership, are such an important vehicle for voter choice. Because we're talking about now shutting down primaries and removing the capacity for voters to participate in party leadership elections, because that's what the primary is. When we talk about the presidential primary, there's more than just presidential candidates on the ballot. There's delegates to the convention, and these constitute party leadership positions. We also have state committee up for election all around the country, and in some places county leadership. But the nature of this Republican situation is basically there is an election in Colorado for state senate. The current occupant of the office is term limited out. There are two people running for this office. One of them is a Representative Larry Liston. Now, I mean state representative, not congressional representative. And then David Stiver, who's just a Republican activist. They both ran, and there was no primary. I imagine it's a special election because this is a term-limited situation. Otherwise, you would expect them just to have a primary. But they both ran, and the Republican committee for that area, for the state Senate district, the Republican committee voted on whether or not these people should be included on the ballot. Each candidate needed 30% to get on the ballot. Well, because of coronavirus, there was no meeting of this committee. Instead, they held it over Zoom and email. And as a result of the proceedings on the way that went down, David Stiver argued that it was held improperly. Now, Larry Liston got 30%, David Stiver did not. So now Stiver's not on the ballot. And so he argues that the way this was conducted with like emailing and then video conference, this was all done improperly and there wasn't enough notice given. So what happens? This actually moves up the food chain of the Republican Party. Two state committees vote on this, as well as the executive committee and the Central Committee. Now, these are terms you're maybe not familiar with. I don't know what they mean by state committee. I imagine they mean actual county committees. That is to say, committees of the state, because the Central Committee is what we in New York call the state committee. For us, the state committee is the overarching committee for the entire state. A lot of states refer to that body as the Central Committee. It's the central organizer of all of the organizations for a party in the state. So their Central Committee weighed in on this. Their state committees weighed in on this, which again, I believe are their local parties. So 2 local parties weighed in. The executive board of the Central Committee weighed in, and the Central Committee itself ultimately weighed in. And they all agreed that because of the way the vote was conducted, it was unfair or held improperly, and that David Stiver should be allowed on the ballot, thereby giving Republicans in the primary, in the primary, a choice. Oh, I get it. Right. Sorry. I'm going to backtrack a second. This wasn't about who would be the candidate. It was about who would be able to run in the primary. And so what they did was they did away with petitioning, presumably because of COVID. So you only needed 30% to get on the ballot for the primary. And so now the Republican Party at multiple levels is saying, yeah, you know what? Let's just let both these guys run. Okay. So the chair of the state party of the Central Committee is this U.S. representative, a congressman, Ken Buck. Ken Buck goes to Eli Bremer, who is the election official, and says, let both of these people run. Basically, Eli Bremer says, in order to let both people run, I need to sign an affidavit saying that both of them got 30% of the vote at the state committee. Again, for these purposes, in Colorado, the state committee is our county committee or our local committee. And he says, I have to attest that both of these people got 30% of the vote, and they did not. And so the government here is pushing back, even though the party has said, we just want to give everybody the opportunity to run effectively. And now this is in conflict with the letter of the law. And so the election official doesn't want to certify both of these people. Now, this really highlights a couple of really interesting facets. Regardless of who you think is right or wrong in this particular situation, there are like 3 really interesting pieces going on here. The first is that it really matters who your state elected officials, who your state party officials are, right? Because you can imagine a situation where this really was, I don't know, for lack of a better word, rigged, where the establishment sits down and says, listen, we're going to conduct this meeting in this way. We're going to do it so that the activist has less of a shot at being on the ballot than somebody who's already elected to office as a Republican. And then we're not going to hear his petition or decide in his favor when he says that it was conducted improperly. Now, I have seen that happen more times than I care to mention, both in New York, in the Democratic Party, and honestly, in the Young Democrats. A lot of folks who are meant to be the future leaders, they take their cues from our current leaders. And here in New York, our current leaders are not really interested in opening things up. A lot of these elections internal to the party are conducted in a way that disenfranchises people and makes it difficult for them to participate. So actually, the people who have been elected to the county committees or these state committees in Colorado on the Republican side, and who occupy the leadership positions in the Central Committee, which is their state committee, these are folks who were willing to look at the way an election was conducted, a vote was conducted, and say, yeah, let's allow another person who's not necessarily part of the establishment. I mean, I don't know who this person is. Maybe he's friendly with all these folks as well. But somebody who's not currently elected, let's allow them a shot in the primary. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is this then runs up against the government and the actual law. Now, why is the government even involved in an internal party decision? Well, a long time ago, the government, and by a long time ago, I mean in the late 1800s, the government basically realized that because of the way we do elections in the United States, political parties are absolutely critical in determining the landscape of elections. Yes, you still get to vote in the general election. Yes, you still get to choose between Democrat and Republican. Yes, you as a voter get a say. But your choice is completely constrained by what the political parties do. And before there were primaries, there were only these committees, and those are your smoke-filled back rooms. The first primary in the United States wasn't held until 1899. And people figured out when people say today, the United States isn't a democracy. The political parties control everything. Yeah, the parties control everything. And yeah, if you don't participate in primaries, it's not a democracy. And people figured that out 150 years ago. 150 years ago, people said, man, this thing's not a democracy because the political parties control our choices. And then one of the parties basically always wins. What can we do about this? And they invented primaries to break open the political parties. And then that started in New York. Well, actually, it started in Wisconsin, but it was implemented here in New York to break the power of Tammany Hall, got really popular, and now everywhere in the country has an open, little d, democratic process within the political parties to select party representation for this purpose. And not just the candidates in the election that you know about, like in the presidential primary, selecting the president, the nominee, but also the leadership of the party, like your county committee members, like your state committee members, like your central committee members, like your national committee members, like your delegates to the national convention. So the state is involved here because the state oversees these elections to make sure that they're conducted appropriately. Again, because it was realized that the parties have such an important role in controlling the political landscape and the options that voters have, that it was deemed not just necessary, but it was deemed a prerogative of the government to control these, what ultimately are semi-private organizations. They're not fully private because they have such an impact on public and civic life. And then third and finally, it matters who's in your government, because the way they craft these laws defines how these parties operate. So in this case, for example, let's give the Republican Party the benefit of the doubt, as hard as it may be. Let's say that they really wanted to give voters a choice. Well, the law of Colorado was crafted in such a way that it constrains their capacity to do this. In New York State, for example, we have laws which govern our county committees and lead to situations where the county parties are empowered or even incentivized to cut voters out of the process in some cases. So, for example, when somebody leaves office and there's a special election here in New York, in the city, for city office, because the city has its own rules about city elections, we just have a special election, a nonpartisan special election. But for state elections governed by state law, when there's a vacancy, the parties choose their nominees in these committees. And then that lends itself to this backroom dealing and the capacity of influential members of the party, like Congress members, like Ken Buck, like the situation in Colorado, which lends itself to the optics of being improper. Here in New York, you oftentimes have this because influential people will put their finger on the scale for their candidate in these closed group settings where all the people know each other and sometimes are beholden to leaders for their jobs or their contracts or what have you. So, it's very, very important to know what the election laws are and to elect people who really, really know what they're doing when they craft these laws. And I'll give you just one more example from New York, which happened. We elected people to replace a group of very bad Democrats, the IDC, Independent Democratic Conference. I'm not going to go into what that conference was. Just know that they were bad folk. We elected a bunch of people to replace them. And we said, these people are great. They're progressives. They're smart. They're going to do the right thing. They're not going to be bad. Well, in an attempt by one of those folks to improve the way the county party structure operated, we consolidated the primaries, but then we had to move the party. In an attempt to make the way New York votes better, we consolidated 2 primaries into one date. That way you don't have to vote twice, and it increases voter turnout. As a result, we had to change the time frame for the meeting of the county committees, because if you move the primary and you elect your leadership at a different time, then the relationship of that election to the actual meeting of those people gets thrown out of whack. Now you've moved things around a couple of months, and now what do you do with these people who have been elected but aren't in office yet? Like they don't meet yet. Who gets the power? And so there was a law that was written by one of these new folk that really made a mess of things, which made it really, really unclear who gets to vote in your local committee. Is it the people elected the year before or the people who are elected this year? Now, you might think, of course, people elected this year become those elected officials in the party and then get to vote going forward. But nope, that's not what the law said. It was written in such a way that it was very, very confusing. And then the party at the election, an election in which I ran for county chair, and they had some degree of incentive to prevent new people from voting, made the argument that the old people should vote, not the new people that you helped get in office. Now, ultimately, we took them to court on this, and we won this and got the new people and the new people were allowed to vote. I still lost, but that's how elections work sometimes. I will say that there was a lot of the conduct of the election, the conduction of that election was actually also very poorly done. You might argue irregularities like there were in Colorado, all of these irregularities. And that brings us actually to one fourth and final point, which is if you're not participating in these party elections, if you're not keeping a watchful eye over how the government writes these laws, your recourse when things go south is not very great. The number one thing, the only thing really I could have done in that situation is sue the party. And we cannot be afraid to sue the party because their laws are effectively the laws governing our democracy. If they violate those rules, or if they conduct elections in an improper fashion, or in a way that leads to chaos or disenfranchises people, we must have the capacity to challenge those decisions. But it becomes very unclear whether or not sometimes you are allowed to sue them and on what grounds, and whether these actually are treated as laws or how they're adjudicated in court. Now in New York, you can go to court and you can sue the party, and sometimes that can work out really well. But an important facet of that is lawsuits cost money. Politicians and political parties tend to have that money, and activists and reformers tend not to. So we're lucky to have a community in New York with a couple of attorneys who, if the case is good and they have time, are willing to adjudicate these matters. For example, the Bernie Sanders delegates got up and sued in this case, the government for canceling the primary. But you need resources to make democracy work. And I gave a whole rant about this a few nights ago, but why resourced people are the ones running the country? It's because successfully participating in politics necessarily requires resources the way it's structured. These party leadership positions are unpaid. The time you put in, the power you wield, it's all done in your off time. When you fight with people, when you want the rules upheld, or you think the rules are unjust, or they conflict with actual law, that takes money. Lawsuits take money. Winning campaigns for these unpaid positions takes money. And you think government politics are bad. Government elections for public office are bad. They are. But all of the little steps that you take to garner influence and power for your community as an activist, every step of the way is difficult, it's fought, and it needs to be resourced. And so I really feel like this story of the Colorado Republican Party and its interaction with the government, while there's arguments on both sides for why something should be done, honestly, it really is so indicative of the interplay between the party structure and the party system in the United States, the acknowledgement by the government that these things need to be regulated because they're so important to public and public and civic life and discourse. And the fact that in order to fully understand and appreciate and participate in these structures, you need to have a certain degree of savvy and resource. It's just a very interesting little nexus of all of this, and I hope that this was informative to folks, because you see people share these headlines, and you look at it and say, oh, the Republicans are at it again, trying to influence elections, but there's actually a very interesting story going on here that says a lot more about our politics in the Republican Party, because again, this sort of stuff happens all the time, and honestly, with a much more nefarious sounding narrative than in New York with the Democratic Party than this instance of the Colorado Republican Party. So I just thought that was an important thing to say, and to give folks this example. And you can just go look this up and read that story for yourself if you're interested. But keep in mind that there's a context here just about how political parties operate in this country. Let's see, we've got some comments. Julian Ballington, is Buddhism a religion? I think the head of the NIH or the Human Genome Project is it about Christian? Buddhism is a religion, and I don't know anything about the NIH being a Christian, but they can do as they please, I suppose, as long as it doesn't influence their government work. Dorian Key, when is the election date for City Council? City Council's in 2021. Do you mean my state committee race? That's June 23rd. And yes, I'll be in touch about that soon. Although I don't think I'm contested, having looked it up. But I'd love to do some campaigning anyway, in a responsible way on the internet. James King. Oh, and phone banking. Yes. James King. This is the difference between political power and political hobbyism. James, I don't know if you've ever read Plunkett on Tammany Hall. I encourage everybody. This is, I think, required reading for anybody who really wants to be in politics. And by be in politics, I mean be an activist. Have a role in shaping the discourse of your community and country. Read Plunkett on Tammany Hall. George Washington Plunkett was one of the bosses of Tammany Hall, and one of the first, Tammany Hall was like Fight Club. The first rule of Tammany Hall was don't talk about Tammany Hall. But this one dude spilled the beans. It's one of the only primary sources that we have on the internal operations of Tammany Hall. And I want to say two things about this. First, you will be surprised how much is the same, despite the fact that Tammany Hall has been destroyed by political reform. So much of politics is still the same, despite the efforts made to undo the corruption and the practices of Tammany Hall. And second, the reason I bring this up is because in the book, which is only 96 pages long, and the book is small, it's only 96 pages long, and you can get it for free. Just Google it on the internet, and the text is completely free on some website that, don't be scared by the fact that the word communist is in the website. Some communist website has just copy and pasted all of the text of this book because I believe it's in the public domain. It was, it's from the 1800s, right? So copyright's expired. The reason I bring this up is because George Washington Plunkett says in his book, reformers can never beat regular politicians. Regular is the word used for, if you ever see a regular Democratic club, if you ever see a regular whatever, regular means anti-reform. Regular means machine, because reformers are progressives or independent Democrats. And I don't want to go into progressives, but so many people think that progressive means left of center. No, that it doesn't. Progressive means anti-machine, anti-corruption. That's what the progressive era of American politics was about. Go look it up. If you are left of center, you might be a progressive. You could also be a socialist, a communist, all sorts of things that have nothing to do with reform. Now, I call myself a reformer. There are a lot of us out there who call ourselves reformers, and this is the true These are the true inheritors to the progressive movement of the late 1800s, early 1900s. But George Washington Plunkett's point was that the progressives of his era would never defeat Tammany Hall. The progressives would never defeat the regulars because progressives are just people who look at something and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if the world were like this? Do a little bit of organizing around the edges and then get walloped by people who actually understand politics. The Democratic Party, Tammany Hall, was the most structured and successful political organization of its time, maybe even of all time, insofar as democracies go. Its structure is the model for every single political party on the planet, or at least model for every single party in a democratic system on the planet. They basically invented the idea of block captains. And I know it sounds like, well, that seems very obvious, but it wasn't. Nobody ever had to organize voters before. Nobody ever needed to have block captains to make sure that people voted before. Block captains was a new idea. It was a fresh, hot thing in, 1860, whatever, or 18... crap. Whenever the franchise was given to all white men. I forget when that was, but that was Andrew Jackson, Jacksonian Democracy. It's why Jackson's on the 20. It's not because he's like the super biggest racist we ever had, and America loves racists, although both of those two things are true. Jackson's on the 20 because of Jacksonian Democracy and his work extending the franchise and making it a truly popular democracy. Again, in his case for white men, but whatever. That changed everything because instead of having just landowners who could vote, you suddenly had all of these people in cities who were renters who could also vote, which required organization. So Tammany is incredibly effective. People raised in the model of Tammany who join the organization, they learn what it is to organize. And he makes the analogy between a shopkeeper and somebody who knows how to run a business and somebody who just has a bunch of money, privileged people basically, who are like, I think I'll open a shop. And he says, the rich person who's a banker or a lawyer who decides I want to open a shop might have a good run of it for a while until the money runs out. And then he's going to realize that the logistics are hard, that the supply and demand are hard, that getting customers is hard, and that business is going to fold. And he basically was saying that political hobbyists will never have true political power in this country because there's too many people who devote their lives to the art and science of politics, and they will always be in control. And so there are those of us who spend an awful lot of time learning these things and being a party to these organizations. And that is just another reason why it requires money and resources to be successful in politics, because so much of it takes so much time and so much effort and so much scrutiny to imbibe the innards, the secret sauce of politics, the rules, the procedures, the parliamentary tricks. All of these things are hard. And so without people who have invested the time to learn them, it's so incredibly difficult to succeed and get ahead. Now, there are folks like me who have done the work and are just anxious, trying to broadcast it, to get it out there, so that people who don't know can learn the lessons without having to go through years of trial by fire. But as James properly said, this is the difference between political hobbyists and those who are focused on political power. And ultimately, hobbyism is a distraction, a fun distraction, an important distraction. But to get real effective change, you need to invest in knowing the system and knowing what's behind the scenes, which is why I am always, always, always encouraging folks to at least wet their toes by running for and joining their local county committee. And if you want any information on how to do this, please message me, comment here. I am always happy to share. And as I promised in a previous video, I am going to start running the Real Politics 101 workshops that I used to do in person, I guess through Zoom calls or something. or maybe Facebook Lives. Probably Zoom calls, because this information is so critical and it's so valuable. And honestly, we need it now more than ever, because we have people. I had somebody tell me today on a Facebook post, I don't have a right to vote in an uncontested primary. Again, we don't have to go into it, but that uncontested primary is, in fact, my right as an American. We have primaries for a reason. We have elections for a reason. Primary elections for political party office are controlled by the state for a reason. And that reason is they're absolutely critical to the structure of our democracy and the choices we get as voters, which are given to us by the political parties. Dorian Key, do you defend the first past the post two-party system? No. I like proportional representation, which is not the same thing as ranked choice voting. I feel like proportional representation used to be the thing that political science folks wanted. Then progressives came along and said, ranked choice voting is the thing to do. And it is if you're stuck in a first past the post system. And I support ranked choice voting for that reason. But ultimately, those of us who are, again, not hobbyists, but much more in politics, understand that proportional voting is a more stable system. Generally speaking, of course, you've got Israel that's had like 5 governments in 2 days. Dorian, I think we both discussed how we both prefer a multi-party parliamentary system without a president. I could go back and forth on the idea of the president. France, for example, has a mixed president model. I have some thoughts on, I think it would be a good model to have to either do one of two things, to have members of the legislature vote, and for the top 3 people in the legislature be put to a public referendum so that they have popular legitimacy, or to go the other way and do a ranked choice vote for the chief executive, and then members of the legislature run, people vote, and then those top 3 are given back to the legislature to choose the prime minister, or in this case, the president. But I do think that there's a legitimate rationale for having a directly elected, popular president. You can also separate the head of government and the head of state, which I think absolutely should be done. It's a much more stable system to have a separate head of government and a separate head of state. And France tries to accomplish this by electing both the prime minister in the parliament and having a directly elected president. Terry Food, Honest Graph, Plunkett, and one of the most interesting parts of Plunkett is definitely, he talks about graft, which you might know is corruption, but he talks about dishonest graft, like I'm going to steal money from the government treasury, and honest graft, basically insider trading, like I'm going to buy land where I'm going to vote to put a park, and then my land value will go up, and then I'll sell it back. And he talks about that as honest graft, because really, why should somebody be in politics and work toward the public good if they can't get a little something on the side? If you're not going to compensate them, why should they just go into business and work against the public interest? Nay, we should allow them to have honest graft. So, for example, he'd be like, these folks who sold their stocks before releasing information about the coronavirus, well, that was just honest graft. As politicians who have made it to the top, they have a right to exercise some degree of financial benefit, which they have earned through constantly garnering the public trust. Now, it's a very interesting argument. He also talks about why the civil service is awful and will destroy any interest in public affairs, basically making the case that if you take away the ability of politicians to appoint all of their friends to government jobs and give them money, then why will those people care about who gets elected? We'll just have massive disinterest in politics. And to be fair, he was absolutely right. When the government couldn't do favors when politicians stopped having the power to do favors for their friends, you did sort of see a precipitous drop in voter turnout. And we're dealing with that today. But I feel like there's other ways to get voter turnout up than to, again, allow corruption. Anyway, all thoughts. But just to give you an example of something that I think still happens in Pennsylvania, you help somebody get elected, you get a job, and then every second Friday on payday, somebody comes around and you give them a portion of your paycheck. And that keeps the party going. It keeps your person in office, and it keeps your job. And it's just one hand washes the other. Now, we do have a system like that in New York for something called comp time. And I've spoken about comp time before, and I experienced this firsthand when I worked for the state Senate, where you get basically your hours that you work over the 8-hour workday. You bank them, and then you're asked to use your extra hours, which you could take as vacation time. It's your compensated time. You're asked to use that to help your party or people who got you your job, or at least didn't try to get you fired, reelected. So, yeah, super interesting. Just the system is really skewed towards incumbents. You know how it is. James Morris King. Read Politics is for Power by Eitan Hirsch. Never read it, although I have heard of that book before. And I'll say, yeah, do that. Although I will say again, Plunkett on Tammany Hall is only 96 pages. James Morris King, that's why I know about it, because it's fairly recent. Published this year. Excellent primer on the difference between the activities necessary to gather and maintain power for any interest or movement, and merely obsessing over the distribution of existing power. There you go. Dorian Key. Did you hear about the Obama call where he is outraged about Trump's coronavirus response? I didn't, but also I'm not surprised in the least. Dorian Key also says, if that is true, why do progressives and the DSA hate neoliberals and moderates in the Democrat Party, such as Buttigieg and Biden? Because they have philosophical differences with them, and very few people, and we've spoken about this before, that the parties in the United States subsume both. When we were talking about base constituencies versus swing constituencies, the political parties, though they are only really two big ones, two that matter, particularly for national elections, that they also profess to represent ideological positions. And the Democratic Party spans a very broad ideological expanse of ideas. Actually, so does the Republican Party now, technically, although it's kind of refining itself into an isolationist, populist, that's sort of it, party. Potential fascist undertones. The Democrats offer, really do span the gamut right now of everything from free market, free trade to communist state-directed enterprise. And then the bulk of the party sits somewhere in between regulated free market capitalism with maybe some components of free trade, but I think a lot of people are really coming to grips with the idea of fair trade, if you will, but fair trade for the United States, and highly regulated capitalism in sort of the Nordic socialist model. But so these two factions of the party are largely at war with each other. And you can see where the preponderance of the vote is based on the presidential election. But the desire of the majority, the legitimate majority of the party, to completely isolate and shut down a sizable minority of the party has led to intense tension between the two of them. Would you ever associate yourself with DSA? Yes, actually, I associate myself with DSA all the time because I back a lot of DSA candidates. Many of them are completely rational with good ideas. DSA certainly has its problems, and as far as organizations go, I am not 100% convinced that DSA is any better than the Democratic Party. They say a lot of really nice things, but I've seen their meetings. Now, their local meetings, local chapters, whatever, quite nice, quite good people. But all institutions have their problems. No institution is perfect. And at the end of the day, people get real nitpicky about power. Again, I was at Occupy Wall Street, which is often law is like, oh, that's the holy grail. And it was terrible. It was terrible. The governance was just the only reason that it worked and you could say that it accomplished things was because individuals got to accomplish things. But as an entity, as an organization, there was no capacity to truly collaborate, I don't think. Like, a few things really came out that worked. Occupy Sandy, Rolling Jubilee. But for the most part, the idea that it wasn't a cohesive, it was not a cohesive structure that allowed for any sort of sustainable power maintenance, right? And so as an electoral force, DSA is sort of like resurgent right now. But while I definitely agree with a lot of what they have to say and what a lot of their candidates profess, and like I support these folks and they're very good community-minded people, and just like the sort of people that DSA attracts are like, a lot of them are salt of the earth because they care about outcomes for individuals. DSA, like the Working Families Party, are organizations, and there are the people who rise up in organizations are often the people who are just the most interested in power. Like the WFP is absolutely 100% no better than the shadiest Democratic Party. It's full of operatives. It's operatives, and they ram through whatever they want on their members, and their policies are slightly left of center. Sorry, their policies are slightly left of Democrats who are slightly left of center, but their governance, it's no difference. They're a political party. They're a machine unto themselves, as is the Independence Party. The Greens to a lesser extent, but still they have their problems. The Libertarians are really the only ones who are out there being like, we're libertarians, we're going to stand on this thing. But that's why they fail to effectively organize in a lot of cases. And, it's exactly what I was saying about DSA, which is that like power doesn't go away because you want to ignore it. And so your only guard against power is good rules that are really conscientious and thought out and good people, and electing them and making sure that people vote, because your prime voters are people who are interested in politics and naturally interested in power. You want people who are disinterested in power and are more interested in outcomes to be your largest voting base, because they will vote ideally for good people. But they have to be engaged enough to be able to see through the smoke and mirrors of jerks. Anyway, it's a long discussion. We could go on. I could just go on it forever. James replying to Dorian, who people identify as enemies and what they actually do to advance their real interests are often poorly correlated. That's great. That's true. That's 100% true. Hating Biden doesn't actually do anything to get power, nor to advance any cause that Biden ostensibly is opposing, nor to advance any cause that Bernie is ostensibly supporting, or that socialists would want to see enacted. Trump does more to harm a progressive cause than Biden does, although people will argue with you on that. But it's just, and I could go into the dynamics of like why that's not the case. But in that sense, like hating on Biden doesn't help lefts, like the left wing of the party. Although there are plenty, don't get me wrong, like I don't like Biden and I'm not going to vote for him in the primary, but I will support him in the general. But there are lots of reasons to really not want to vote for that guy. And there are lots of legitimate reasons. But understand that it's less legitimate to give Donald Trump any additional capacity to win the national election if you want progressive outcomes. And the degree to which you want progressive outcomes, you should invest in defeating Donald Trump. So, yeah, I might not like Biden, but I am going to do what I can to a certain extent to help him win. Like, I'll phone bank, I'll try to organize, and not because I'm a Democrat and not because I'm a leader in the party, but because I understand that my interests are more furthered by a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency. But, also, as I've said before, the Senate, the federal Senate is just so important. And so a lot of energy could be spent there very productively as well. Deidre Levy replying to Dorian, who asked why people hate on Buttigieg. The Atlantic article The Atlantic wrote an article on why young progressives hate Pete Buttigieg, and I do. I mean, that guy, oh God, he's such an empty suit. Oh my God, I saw him at the Young Democrat. We can save this for another time because now, like, I'm really hungry and like we're way an hour into this. But I saw him at the Young Democrats. I went to the Young Democrats convention in Indiana last summer, and he spoke. And I'm just going to say this one thing because I was just in that moment, I was like, nope, 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 nope. He got up there, he gives a speech, and he's like, we got all these problems. This is a problem, and that's a problem. This politician, like, yeah, those are, yeah, exactly. What are you going to do about that? And then the second half of his speech was, and I want to come back here in 10 years after being president for 2 terms and talk about how we solved this problem and that problem and this. And I was like, what? Whoa, wait. But what happens in those 10 years? What's your plan, bro? And then he ended his speech without talking about any ideas, and then booked it without shaking any hands to get to a fundraiser and to talk to the media. And I just was like, corporate tool. What a dude. This is his home state, presumably his top constituency, young people. And you know who stuck around and shook every goddamn hand in the room? Marianne Williamson. Anywho, James says, this is the David Plott's position on corruption. Presumably you're talking about honest graft is okay. Again, for those just joining, read Plunkett of Tammany Hall. James Morris King goes on, any political party is subject to the failures and vicissitudes of power. Just having the best ideas isn't a vaccine against all the things that make people angry about existing power structures, nor are they a vaccine against people abusing power, wanting power, corralling and goading others, and preserving power for themselves by subverting democratic rules. There is no vaccine against that except for good rules, good legal structures and appeal processes, and involvement by people who care. And the fact is that the really, really sclerotic structure and political organization of the Democratic Party is separate entirely from the ideals and platform of the party. And you need both, and both are determined by party leadership, like the delegates to the National Convention, who will now have an opportunity to run in the primary since we have uncanceled the presidential primary in New York. Now, mind you, this is exactly the same situation for the Republican Party, but because of their activist base in 2009, 10, whatever, the Tea Party, their leadership was brought into much stronger alignment with the, I don't want to say ideals of the party because some of their Republican platform is like pretty liberal, but into much greater alignment with the ideals of their most vocal constituency. Dorian Key. He's angry at me for calling Buttigieg an empty suit. Okay. He's not an empty suit. He's just a suit filled with an empty man. How about that? God, Ben wants Orb Lady before President Pete. Facepalm. I didn't say that. I had pretty strong confidence that neither one of them would be president, and I was okay with that. I didn't really necessarily think that it would be Joe Biden. I mean, I supported Elizabeth Warren, and I find it somewhat difficult to understand how she performed so poorly, given how well she was doing early on. I mean, I guess that's not like current success isn't a predictor of future success, as they always tell you in stocks. But like, she was decently popular. She had really good plans. I mean, she was the thinking person's candidate, and that seemed like it was going to win the day over, given the foil of Donald Trump, the unthinking person's president. But yeah, that didn't go. So that's sort of where I was at that moment, very much in the Elizabeth Warren camp, and here we are. So not Orb Lady, but not Pete Buttigieg either. yeah, and then I guess now I'm left with Sanders. Well, I'll get to vote for Warren in the primary since all the candidates are back on board. Although I will say I'm very much impressed with the Bernie delegates who filed that suit. So I will certainly, even though I'll be voting for Warren, I will also be voting because you can vote for the delegates and the presidential nominee separately. For the love of God, this is an election for delegates as much as it is for president. I will certainly be voting for a lot of my friends who are Sanders delegates to ensure that they get to go to the convention. So, in any event, I've been talking for way too long, and thanks everybody for sticking around. It's always great to see. I appreciate the comments, and next week I'm going to set up. Well, next week because I got a monitor for my thing. We're going to do a Zoom, and I will let folks know in advance. It'll probably be on Friday. We'll do a Friday Zoom, and then we'll do another one. We had somebody tune in, like come on screen with me yesterday in the new double Facebook Live feature, and we'll have that again, and I'll try to bring on somebody who can talk about an interesting topic. So we'll do that. We'll do the Zoom. We'll have a lot more interactivity next week. Probably do the dual live thing on Wednesday. Do the Zoom on Friday, and we'll see how people like it. And then we'll get some feedback, and then I'll schedule one of the workshops. Maybe I'll break it up because, well, whatever. Then I'll do one of the workshops. Okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. It's wonderful to see y'all. Happy Saturday. See you tomorrow at 8:30.